Good afternoon, everyone. We are delighted to continue the conversations from this morning, and we've had the pleasure of hearing from a number of individuals and from a number of sector perspectives on water issues more broadly speaking. My name is Steve Edwards. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Politics here at the University of Chicago, and it's my great pleasure to introduce this conversation, which is in many respects an attempt to bring together those various perspectives into one shared conversation around how we can actually align agendas and overcome the various challenges and friction points that exist between the public and private sectors, between researchers and policymakers and the like. So we're delighted to have with us three individuals on stage who can speak really powerfully to elements of this. They include on my far left Tom Stanley, who is with GE. He's the Chief Technology Officer for GE's Water and Process Technologies. They have two big buckets of business, including the equipment side, but also they're doing a lot of work in the process side, and we've heard a lot about filtration technologies. GE's doing a lot in that space, and we'll hear a bit more about that in a minute. Next to Tom, in the middle, is Aaron Cook, who is the Chief Resiliency Officer for the City of Chicago. You have a detailed bio on all of these individuals, but Aaron comes to this role after working in the Water Department and also working for Mayor Bloomberg in the City of New York. The title Chief Resiliency Officer speaks to the Rockefeller Foundation's recent investments in creating 100 resilient cities around the globe, and this water portfolio fits in quite powerfully to that work. And then to my immediate left is Subrata Guha. You heard from him in our most recent panel. He's a professor here at the Institute for Molecular Engineering at the University of Chicago. Much of his work relates to some of the sensing technology we've talked about and the applicability of sensors in agriculture and also work in India, doing a lot of foregrounding in water treatment and improving water quality in those areas. So please join me in welcoming all of them to the stage. It's great to have you with us. So Aaron, let me start with you. Chief Resiliency Officer, what does resiliency mean in the context of water in your portfolio in cities today?
Sure, thank you. It's great to be here, and thanks to all of you for joining. So resilience in the context of the Rockefeller 100 Resilient Cities program and as applied to cities is about how you adapt, grow, and thrive in the face of shocks and stresses. So if you try to unpack that a little bit, shocks, in the case of water, we have big rainstorms that we have seen historically and that we are seeing increasingly with climate change that impact our residents, cause flooding throughout Chicago as well as the greater region. If you think about potential failures of water infrastructure and having citizens not have access to water, that is a potential shock. And then stresses. Certainly in the context of Chicago, we think a lot about poverty, violence, neighborhood community issues, inequality issues. And in many ways, our aging infrastructure for water contributes to some of those stresses and challenges that we have to think through how we upgrade our infrastructure to increase access and improve quality of life in cities and in neighborhoods.
So one of the questions I want to pose to all three of you is what you need from the other sectors that you're not currently in. And let me stay with you, Aaron, on that. So thinking about those challenges and the others that relate to water in a metropolis of 9 million people, and from your perch as a government official, what would you like to see more of from the private sector and from the research and innovation sector that would be useful in addressing these issues?
Sure. Well, I think there's a lot of potential areas. First, just to understand, Chicago is a city that has a large legacy of water infrastructure dating back to the middle of the 19th century. And just to put it in perspective, we have about 4,400 miles of sewer pipes and an equal number of water mains. That would stretch, it might get you all the way to China if you were to stretch that all in one long area. So we have this incredible system that's already in place, and we know in many cases in our sewer system we're under capacity and we're not well equipped to deal with the rainstorms. We know we're not just going to go rebuild the rainstorm. So what are the innovations that we can implement in public spaces, in homes, to help better manage water on site where it falls? And I think there's a lot of innovative technologies that could be deployed there, and we've certainly done some, but we have room to grow there. On the drinking water side, we've got aging infrastructure. Certainly in the news, there's a lot of lead pipes that are in private property, and not city's infrastructure, but connecting to the city's infrastructure from private property. I think there's a huge technological challenge and policy challenge for how to think through that challenge for our citizens. And how you think through this tremendous gap that we have from the need to upgrade and replace infrastructure versus the amount of funding. And we know that we need to be smarter and better about innovating and using new technologies and being smarter about how we do things so that we can most cost effectively address these challenges and problems.
Yeah. I want to invite everybody to participate in this conversation. So Tom and Supratik, if you have points you want to raise, and Aaron, as we go forward, don't hesitate to jump in. Tom, let me come, though, to you. Thinking about challenges and frictions from someone in the private sector who's doing research and working on solutions to many of these issues, what would you like to see more of from the government sector in particular, globally speaking, not just in a city like this one?
Yeah. So, one thing that resonated with me this morning as I listened to the conversations, we talked a lot about water recycle, taking the effluent from wastewater treatment plants and then using them for a suitable purpose. We sell a device called a membrane bioreactor, which is really a fancy filter. It's a hollow fiber filter that extracts water from the biology tank, and it removes essentially all the suspended solids. So, pieces of biomass, but also bacteria, viruses, anything that's in there. It doesn't remove the stuff that's dissolved, but it's a very high quality water that then potentially could be upgraded slightly depending on the final use. It's crazy to take water like that and dump it into the ocean. And we do that from wastewater treatment plants on the coast all over the country. The opportunity to take that and relieve some of our stress issues, especially in California where there is a big water stress. But there are barriers to being able to do that, and that's why we only recycle in this country something like 10% of the water. Maybe it's 15% in California because there's been more pressure to do that in recent years. So in my view, it'd be a very wise use of government time and energy to help create the incentives that would connect the municipalities, the wastewater treatment plants, to the end users and make sure the incentives are there for that to make financial sense on both sides of the divide there, to make sure that we do that and we recycle much more of that water.
Two follow-ups. So what are the barriers that you cite, and what are the incentives that would be needed?
Well, I think there can be tax incentives. I think there can be, at the end of the day, people respond to financials. People respond to financials, and green needs to be green. So if someone has a choice between drilling a well and taking water out of an aquifer or working with a local municipality to use that recycled water and maybe upgrade it a little bit, they're going to go with the cheapest answer. I mean, you see that with some of the decisions that are made in agriculture, for example, in California these days. So at the end of the day, the incentive needs to make it the low-cost solution for us for that to work.
Well, and Aaron, thinking about the challenges that many units of government here in the United States, at least, face when it comes to funding. To what extent can tax incentives and other things be useful instruments to try and accelerate the kind of innovation and implementation curve that we're talking about here?
Well, I think it would be dependent on what the utility or the city is facing as far as water supply and need for additional infrastructure. So in the case of Chicago, that has about 2.1 billion gallons of capacity for water coming from our treatment plants, and we use on average for what we sell out to our citizens in the region about a third of that on a daily average. So we don't have a lot of need for additional capacity. We sell water to fund our programs. That's a vital revenue source for us. So the type of incentive structure might not make sense in a place like Chicago, but if you're a place out, let's say in San Diego, that's looking at building new plants to desalinate water, and you're choosing between incentivizing reuse versus building new infrastructure to accommodate growth or demand, then I think that absolutely makes sense. So you just have to make sure that you're aligning the on-the-ground situation of water need, water infrastructure, and all those complex local factors with the type of choices
Agreed.
You have to make.
Yeah.
Here wouldn't necessarily be a good cost-benefit program for us to make those kinds of incentives available, but in a place like California, Australia, Israel, maybe parts of China for all I know, that might be a really smart strategy. We know just generally it's more cost effective to conserve and reuse water than to build new infrastructure for new supply.
Yeah, we're talking about China here today, and I think we discussed it a little bit this morning, but there's a lot of industry in China in very arid regions in the central northern part of China. And the government now has regulations around for zero liquid discharge, essentially recover all the water from, these are industrial plants versus municipal. But this has created a big business opportunity for us and other companies. And it's an example where there's a huge need to create that incentive, in that case by regulation, to ensure that we use that water very efficiently.
All right, so Pratik, you've been sitting patiently listening. So let me come to you and bring you into this conversation. I didn't mention in your background, which is also in the bio, that you spent, before coming here to the university, a considerable amount of time at IBM. So you know the private sector, you also know the academy. As you look out and think about cross-sector friction and cross-sector cooperation, what are the big needs and barriers that you identify?
So I think I can give you the perspective from the technology point of view. I think if you look at water, one of the critical areas is sensing of water and building systems that will measure and monitor water. And there is much less resources from, say, funding agencies or the government towards water today. Just compare it, for example, with the amount of money spent on information technologies or computing or building faster computers, beating Moore's law. The challenges with water and the food and that whole nexus globally is enormous. It is of equal significance, but there's far little money spent on sensor development. And as a result, you see that sensor development isn't mature enough. For instance, in agriculture today, you measure rainfall still using 150-year-old technology. There's a bucket and a tipper, and then you count it. And that's where things are. It hasn't moved. Industry and university collaboration, I think that has frankly improved a lot over the past 10, 15 years, and it will only get better. I think with water, there are two things. There's this whole bigger picture of getting better water for the world, but you have to make your advances through monetizing stuff and finding a good business model. And I think Tom was kind of alluding to that as well. Finding a good business model is very important if I'm making a better sensor. This is where a lot of stuff gets stuck. So if you're in a company, you're measuring some kind of water and a city can use it, cities usually don't have that much money. So it's not a great business model to try to go and develop. But if you can think of a clever model, an example is, a good example, and this doesn't have to do with water, but it's relevant, is traffic light mounted cameras, right? You go to a city, you say you put it on, and money will come to you because you'll get more tickets automatically. To find something like that for water monitoring, right? I think that's the trick.
Yeah.
So that's the piece that needs to come out of this industry university thing.
So, I mean, as you describe that is a situation, just using the traffic light analogy, where essentially the private sector figured out, or a business figured out what it could do and to incentivize cities to adopt it. So it wasn't a governmental thing necessarily.
No.
Now we're also talking about this in a U.S. context, right?
Right.
And even how we define sectors and how those sectors interrelate is very different when we're talking about China. So if you actually extrapolate this to a Chinese context or to another international context, why wouldn't we see sensors adopted more rapidly in other parts of the globe?
I think you could if you could come up with good business models like these. So for instance, if you were able to figure out water pollution in a river or a waterway or something, that's relevant here as well as in any other country. And if you were able to figure a way of identifying who's breaking regulations and dumping junk into the water, that could be a good business model, right? So I think scientists start needing to think about that. But that now means that not only do you make the devices or the materials, but you are also thinking about the whole system as a whole.
So a different mindset.
Different mindset. As we go forward with sensors and so on, people want to push a button and get a response in their smartphone. Right?
Well, and
they don't worry about what's in between so much.
Well, and Tom Supratik, in the last conversation, we also heard, I don't want to overinflate this, but just to be playful, we heard this battle between the sensing forces and the filtration forces when it comes to the technology and the research. What's your sense of the way in which competing technologies actually inhibit broader progress towards adoption and reaching of bigger goals for society? How real of an issue is that?
It depends on the field, and this is where things like standardization comes along. So I'll give you a good example where competing technologies, because of standardization, it worked for everyone. Take your Wi-Fi connections, right? You can have any kind of laptop, you walk in and you're connected. And that happened because IEEE, the Institute of Electronics Engineers, had standardization, right? So there's sort of one type of technology where everybody has to plug into it. A bad case is, cell phone connectors, right? It's getting standardized now, right?
Yeah.
But so I think, water is an area where standardization, I think, has to come. Sensors, sensing networks. It's not quite there yet, is my feeling.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, and I think Seth made the point this morning earlier that water sources vary dramatically. And you need, in general, a series of tools. In chemical engineering speak, you build a flow sheet out of various unit operations that affect the changes that you want to go from dirty water on the input to clean enough water on the output. And I think it's good to have a variety of tools out there. So competition between competing resources is good. In some cases, one solution is best for this kind of water and another solution is best for that kind of water. And even if one is best on a global basis, ultimately, it's probably good to have that competition and drive towards the winning horse at the end of the day. So I think in general, it's that competition is good.
Another interesting point worth noting that came out several times in some of the earlier sessions has to do with a trend that some have observed. I think Mark Templeton talked about this, that we're seeing increasing moves to smaller, more localized responses to different water problems, and a move away from the kind of gray infrastructure, large-scale governments, the major force in this space. Do you see it the same way?
I think so. I think the discussion this morning that it depends on the local conditions. Ultimately, again, I think it drives to the low-cost solution. In the U.S., I think there's more and more private operators of municipalities, and I think, or of water networks, both drinking water and wastewater treatment. And I think we'll see more of that. They'll drive towards the low cost. And if that means a more decentralized solution, we'll see that. And certainly in emerging economies, I think that point was made. You'll see much more in emerging economies.
Which creates more opportunities for you and your competitors to come in and offer solutions, to scale things, and to actually step into a zone that had not been there necessarily from a market standpoint. Right?
Sure.
What does that do for the speed of innovation and the acceleration of the kinds of things you're talking about?
I think there's a lot of localized innovation and localized models being developed, but because of the velocity of information transfer, good stuff gets disseminated very, very fast, right? Really fast. I mean, I know in the context of battery technologies, for instance, like when I was growing up in India, it took like 2 to 3 years for the technology to come from the US to India. When the Sony Walkman came out, it was like 3 years after that I got mine. Right? Today, state-of-the-art battery you will find in places that don't have electricity. So I think this localized model is very good because there is information. If it works, information transmits very quickly.
Yeah. What are the limits, though, of a localized approach, as you see it, if any?
Well, I think...
And is that a better thing, given the challenges that a city like Chicago is facing from an infrastructure maintenance and funding standpoint?
Well, I think the issue is you're not going to get one or the other. I think you have to recognize, at least in a city like Chicago or a larger developed city, you have this legacy infrastructure system that's not going away. So we can add on top of that system with smaller localized approaches. I mean, one example we've been working on is green stormwater infrastructure, where we recognize that we just can't solve all of our sewer capacity issues by building bigger sewers, so we're going to try to keep water out of our sewer system by capturing it where it falls in green infrastructure, in tree pits and in permeable pavements. And that's a great strategy, but we're not going to just move 100% that way and manage all of our stormwater that way. First of all, it wouldn't work, but even if we wanted to, we have this other system that still has value. And so I think you have to understand that you have to figure out how you layer these things on top of each other, and it's not necessarily one versus the other, but it's how you understand that intricate, complicated web of infrastructure systems.
Yeah. I want to ask a long-term versus short-term question, though. So that seems rational in the short term. But if you're thinking out long-term, is there a scenario where it would make sense for a unit of government, municipality, to totally and radically rethink the legacy infrastructure approach? Is that a realistic possibility? And what would it take to envision that? Tom's motioning. Funny.
I love your perspective. I mean,
Yeah.
Just in general, it's hard to compete against infrastructure on the ground. You come out with a new device, and in a new application, it may be the device of choice. But when you have infrastructure in the ground, it's hard. It's really hard to.
It's hard to envision because, I mean, you think about moving from. You brought up Sony Walkmans, right? Like nobody walks on with those anymore because we've replaced that with first iPods and now iPhones or whatever device you're carrying around. And the replacement cost was low, right? If you were to put a current value on the infrastructure we have in place in water, it's in the billions, if not trillions of dollars of value. I mean, we have a water filtration plant called Jardine that has a capacity of about 1.6 billion gallons a day. If you were to build that this was built in 1961, if you were to build that today, we're talking about a piece of infrastructure that would cost about $10 billion to build.
10 billion.
Yes, conservatively. And that provides a critical function to the city, and we just can't, you just can't go start bucketing water from Lake Michigan into people's homes, right? It's hard to envision a radical transformation of that system. So you have to sort of understand how you layer onto that or retrofit, because that system, and it still works, frankly, it works very well. And we meet and exceed all federal standards for drinking water quality. The pump capacity works. We all rely on it every day that live in Chicago. So it works. And the question, so I think we're more interested, even looking long term, at the incremental evolution of these systems versus complete revolution of these systems because of the nature of the infrastructure itself.
I want to come, Scott Moore of the World Bank earlier talked about 5 principles. 2 of the principles that he talked about include equity when we're thinking about water globally. Another concerns fiscal viability. We've talked a little bit about the fiscal viability piece. But the equity piece, I'm interested to get a couple of different perspectives. So Pratik, you've been doing a lot of work in India, thinking about equity from a health standpoint. So when you think about equity, how does first of all, set up the work you're doing, and then tell us the role that the various sectors should be playing in accelerating that kind of equity.
So what I've been interested in doing in India, and actually working with Biplav, who's sitting here, is the rivers in India are tremendously polluted, and fecal coliform, for instance, is very, very high, and there's no good measurement of this. And given the advances in wireless and sensors and technology in the cloud, it's our goal to start a pilot to measure the water quality as a function of location and space, and it would be automated measurement because you don't want to rely on someone, because in those places you can't rely on people to make reliable measurements. And so you want everything automated, but you have to adapt to the place. You cannot put fixed sensors because they'll be stolen. Mm-hmm. But labor is cheap, so you can hire a boat and a boatman and tell him or her to go on a sortie every day. But the idea is to then start aggregating this data over time and try to then predict the flow of pollutants, look how it is affecting local health on its river banks. These are just some of the things that we think might be possible, but once this data is aggregated and studied, I'm sure there's a lot of stuff that can be figured out.
It would seem that the government could have a significant role in a couple of ways. One, in helping accelerate the adoption of that technology, so the data you're getting at scale is good. The other, though, would be actually forming policy responses in response to the data, right? Whether that is to stop a pollution source, to address it in other ways.
Right.
What kind of engagement do you have right now from governments?
So in the case of India, from our discussion with the government, there's tremendous excitement on the very top levels. So the ministers, the administrative officers. But in India, there is a big cadre of career, administrative people. And it's very difficult. They're like a big capacitance, so it's very difficult to get them to move.
Why?
So, in some ways it's a status quo. They have other things going on. A new government, when it comes, the Modi government has tremendous passion for doing these kinds of things. But between the voltage at the top and the circuit at the bottom, there's a lot of, signal gets dissipated. So, but that's the reality. I haven't really, investigated, but we've seen the consequences of that. So that slows things down. And part of it is because there isn't much awareness. So it's a chicken and egg kind of thing. So what we're trying to do, and we received some funding for this, is to get the awareness out. If we can get this data, it is available to everybody, then I think people come to know. I'll give you an example. There is a river called the Godavari River in India, and there is no good data. If you look at the official announcements, they say that there's no fecal coliform. The numbers are ridiculously low, so low that you won't believe them. And yet, before a public festival where people would bathe, the government goes and cleans the water up. So first of all, there is just the need for establishment of baseline data just to set what's the case. And then there are these other things like, can you predict, can you pinpoint pollutant sources, can you make the public more aware, which would be a big piece of this whole thing. So those are the three things that I would call would be the equity you're asking about.
Tom, thinking about India, GE is doing a lot of work around the globe, particularly in China. What are the unique opportunities and challenges in dealing with the Chinese system from a company like GE?
I think we're focusing on the muni space primarily here today. We actually have relatively little business in China, simply because there are local competitors that are very, very challenging for an international company like GE to compete with. Now, I think my new friend Connie was talking that there's more of a focus on lifetime performance and looking at the system cost over the life of an asset versus the initial capital cost, which I think creates an advantage for us to come in where our capital cost may be higher, but maybe we have a more robust solution that looks better over a 10 or 15-year lifetime. And I'm hoping that as that mentality spreads, we'll have more success in a place like
tell me more about the competition. Obviously, it's a competition creates challenges, but are there specific ones in this context that that's to say, is there a predisposition to favor local companies? Are there regulatory challenges that you face when you're trying to actually get in play?
I think maybe two things I'll comment on there, Steve. One is if the hurdle is initial capital cost, you can have something that isn't as effective, doesn't last as long, but you're going to win the game if that's the focus. That hurts us. And the other is, I think, Professor Ma talked about it earlier, that there have been increasing regulations in China over the last 5, 10, 15 years, but they haven't been paid attention to. And a lot of them have been overlooked. That's changing dramatically now. And we're seeing that, we're feeling that in the marketplace there, that now all of a sudden regulations are being taken much more seriously. And that opens the door up.
One of the other pieces of equity that is resonant here for people in Chicago is water pricing. So we, Aaron, have seen water rates increase over the last couple of years in an effort to cover the cost of infrastructure, to make that price of water no longer be so artificially low and reflect more approximately the value. How do you think about the pricing needs and cost needs with the equity concerns in terms of what residents are going to have to pay, and residents of different means? It's a different way of shaping the equity thing, but one that I think is clearly understood here.
Yeah, it's something that we think about, and I think most cities think about when they try to set water prices. And we're sensitive to the impacts that water rate increases have on lower income households and families.
And they hadn't been increased for a long time.
No, in Chicago, when the mayor took office in 2011, and when I worked in New York City, we'd always look at water rates compared to other peer cities. And New York was in the top, maybe 2/3 of higher prices. And then Chicago was always way at the bottom. And for a lot of reasons, we have a local source that's right at our doorstep and lower cost, et cetera, et cetera. We hadn't been keeping up with the upgrade and maintenance of our infrastructure effectively. And so when the mayor came in, he announced a major capital plan to upgrade our infrastructure, replace 900 miles of water main over a 10-year period, replace and reline sewers, upgrade our pumping stations, and make the type of investments that frankly had been ignored for many years, and meet a rate of replacement and repair that was commensurate with the rate of installation back in the 1890s, 1880s, those decades where we were doing about 100 miles a year. And there's frankly no other way to pay for it but to raise water rates. The federal government long ago in the US got out of the game of providing grants to cities. There's lower interest loans, but that's, so we take advantage of some of those, certainly. So there's a choice. Either you invest in your infrastructure or you don't. And the mayor made the choice, and I agree with strongly, that you have to invest in your infrastructure. It's really, literally the backbone of our city, and we rely on water. If you've ever not had water for any period of time, you realize how valuable that is. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is that while it's never great to raise cost of water, I just actually paid my water bill last night. I own a single-family home. It came out to about $50 a month. I've got a small home. I've got a family of 4. And that compared to my natural gas bill is lower. It's lower than my ComEd bill significantly. It's lower than my wireless phone bill. It's lower than my cable internet bill. So water is still lower than those other utilities, and I would argue is even more of a critical function. So the cost value proposition is still quite great.
Well, let me come back to the point you were about ready to make in terms of the trade-off and how you think about it, because there are a lot of people that say, yeah, we should raise it more, given the importance of the resource and given those cost comparisons that you made. Absolutely, water should be priced much more highly here than it would be elsewhere. So what are the considerations when you're thinking about how you're setting rates?
Well, it's interesting. So if you look across, at least in the cities in the U.S. that I've looked at, the rate setting isn't, let's calculate what the cost of the infrastructure is over time, and let's calculate what the value would be on the market. It's more, all right, this is our set of investments we need to make, this is a set of operating costs, and let's raise it commensurate with what we need to keep going, right, to pay pensions and pay healthcare and pay materials and labor, et cetera. And so every city just sort of raises it as they need going forward. I don't think cities they step back and say, let's look at this from scratch and say, what would the price of water be? So what we do is cities raise their rates to meet their needs, and we don't raise it above our needs because we're not in the business of, we're not trying to generate a profit. We're trying to cover expenses and keep it as low as possible. Sure, it's arguably more valuable than what we're charging for that water, but we're not in the business of raising water rates to pay for other things. And we've got some pretty strict, at least as it comes to water and sewer rates, that we're not paying for non-water related expenses. So it's not like we're raising those rates purely on water sales to go pay for new roads or new parks.
Can I ask, do you think about stuff like if you're drawing down an aquifer, and do you think about raising rates to try and get ahead of that?
Well, we've got Lake Michigan, so
it's an issue here, right?
We don't have to in that case. I mean, we look longer term at what our needs are for our infrastructure. So if we were, let's say, envisioning a major capital replacement 20 or 30 years down the road, then you could certainly make a strong case to raise rates enough to be paying for that cost down the road.
Do you see raising rates as a way of it being a deterrent for wasting water?
We don't necessarily look at it that way, but there's been plenty of studies, and I think the data bears out that as rates go up, people use less water. And we've seen in Chicago, our water usage in the city of Chicago since about 1990 through today is down about 40%. And that's not normalized for population. And that's a lot of reasons for that. I think we've become smarter about fixing leaks. We've done a lot of proactive replacement of water. We've switched a significant number of customers to meters, the efficiency standards in the market. But I think there is, if you were to conduct a study of this, I think the price of water has encouraged some people to reduce their use.
And so, Pratik, you, in your work, are also focused in many respects on innovations that can improve conservation, or at least make water usage much more efficient. Right. Tell us more about the work you're doing in agriculture to help us be just much more mindful of the reality.
So this is an area that I'm relatively new to. My background has been computer microchips. But basically, agriculture consumes about 70% of freshwater usage. 80% of the ammonia produced worldwide is used for fertilizers, for nitrogen. And there's estimates that water and fertilizer and even pesticides probably are overused by factors of 2 to 5x. Because they're not measured
2 to 5 times greater than the need.
Yeah. Because they're not measured accurately. So farmers will overcompensate.
And the risk of using too little is economically enormous.
Yeah. Right, because the plant will get stressed. So they overuse it. And this whole business it's not that farmers don't want to use sensors. This has been my observation. It is because the technology is not cheap enough. You need these sensors, 10, 20 meters apart because soil changes. It's more porous here, it's rockier there. So if these things have to be 10, 20 meters apart, these sensors really need to be cheap. But with this data, there's people with ideas about getting better prescriptions for soil, for water delivery, moisture, even seed selection, right? You can really learn the microclimate of a land. You select the seed. For instance, winter wheat alone, there are, I think, 160 varieties in the Midwest. Now, this is something the big agricultural seed companies are doing as well. But this kind of thing ought to be sort of an open data, open platform kind of information. So there's a lot that can be gained.
And why isn't an open data, open platform kind of situation?
It is a new field. It's an emerging field. I don't really know why it isn't that. It may be that the people who got into this field earlier on have been more sort of confidential. Do research along those lines or development along those lines. But this is still an emerging field, and my own research is geared towards trying to find better ways of measuring soil moisture. Soil nitrates, finding dissolved nitrogen in soil is an unsolved problem. If somebody can find a good, cheap way of measuring soil nitrates with parts per million sensitivity, that's a huge win. So those are some of the areas that I am working on.
And one of the aspects of this that we've talked about is, if I correctly understand it, is also using satellite imagery to understand between that and sensing technology which portions of your fields may actually have underwatered crops versus those that are fine. Can you actually be more strategic in where you're actually irrigating?
Exactly. Yeah. So if you look at satellite imagery, that's another area that is booming. Okay. You probably know that the Landsat satellite takes data of every piece of this globe twice a month. And this data is available to you free. You can download it. There are newer satellites coming on board. There is a European satellite agency, and that's come online as well. And people are seeing the value of this data because you get this data in about 8 or 10 different, wavelengths or colors of light. So you can almost do sort of geographical, what we call spectroscopy, So there's interest in trying to identify crops by looking at the satellite images. If you can predict harvest. These are unsolved problems, but people are trying to combine big data, statistics, satellite imagery, a little bit of physics to try to figure this out. So I think that's also emerging. Going forward, these images will be available in much higher resolution. And all of this is going to be used in agriculture, in water, in geographical experiments.
Tom, one of the things that Supratik said a second ago is just the challenges of getting the technology cheap enough to be broadly adopted enough, where there could be open source data and so forth. One of the questions that comes up when we talk about essential resources, especially water, is what role should the private sector play in this? And what are the challenges and business-wise, ethically, of being a for-profit entity in a resource space that is a universal necessity?
I hate answering that question. No, at the end of the day, our job and people in the private sector are going to build the devices that are going to be used to, do all the things that we've talked about here, bring all this technology forward. At the end of the day, you need somebody to build the factories and build the devices. I think one of the things that we can do is do a better job of communicating with startups and with universities and help understand the path from an early stage technology to commercialization, and make sure that we help, make sure that there is a logical path there to a technology that's going to be economical in the system that will ultimately be applied. So, I think that's one thing we can do and should do. But at the end of the day, private sector companies, they're in the business of making money. And so that's part of the equation, is to make sure we have economical technology. Now, GE's got a foundation, and we do a lot of stuff, and especially in emerging economies. But our primary goal is to support that profit-making business. I think the other thing we can do, and it's related to communication. I'm reflecting on my conversation this morning with David St. Pierre, where just listening more around what are the needs and what are the gaps, and making sure that we're focused on the right thing. I was surprised. We think inside the battery limits of the wastewater treatment plant or drinking water plant, and just recently we've started to think, how can we help and how can we do things outside the battery limits? And David, he talked about groundwater, and how do we do a better job managing groundwater and keeping it from coming into the plant, so into the wastewater treatment plant. So maybe there are some things there. And the other one I thought that was fascinating was, can you intercept the nutrient-rich agricultural runoff and keep it from coming into the wastewater treatment plant or going into the rivers, and use that in a more effective way? So I think we have to think a little bit more broadly around where should we be thinking about solutions and where should we be applying solutions. I think we can still do that in a profit-making way, but maybe bring a lower cost solution ultimately to the problem.
I think keeping things open source and making money, they don't have to be exclusive of one another. The information technology industry has shown that. Linux and companies making money off of it. So I don't see any issues there. It's just picking cleverly, what do we let everybody have, and then how can people get business models off of it?
Let's open the conversation up to your questions. So we have microphones floating around. We've got a hand up here and one in the back. Yes.
So this might be a touchy question, but I'll ask it anyway. So the City Council of Chicago just passed a water and sewer tax, which goes into effect next year. And my understanding is that none of those dollars are for water or sewer. They are to address our vastly underfunded municipal pension funds. And so in a
I was very careful to say that our water funds are not going to pay for roads and parks. I did not say that the tax on our water is. I figured this might come up.
So the homeowners are not, I think, as subtle and nuanced as you are in your evaluation. And so I guess my question is, in an environment where we have massive infrastructure needs, and that would be the likely place to look for those resources, would be a tax or price on that water. How do we protect those resources from going to obvious other needs, but you're sending a signal in the wrong channel that way?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair question or critique if I take it as such, and I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there's tough choices, right? We have to make these really. I mean, the mayor. I mean, you look at what he has to do every day, and he has to basically choose between a really bad choice and a not so bad but still pretty bad choice, and you know, to his credit, I think he makes choices. He doesn't punt, and he makes the less bad choice most often, in my opinion. So that's the world we have to face. We have a problem. I mean, in the case of the municipal pension fund that he is shoring up with this tax on water, many of those pension workers are people who work in the water utility. So it's not 100% disconnected from water as a source, because let's say my pension when I worked in the water department is coming from that source as well. But it's a challenge. I think there's the ideal. This is what we would strive for, and then there's we have to make sure that the city's pension fund doesn't go bankrupt, and all of these people that were hired and are deserving of a pension based on their hard work don't lose that pension. And it's the unfortunate nature that sometimes you have to make really tough decisions that might not be the most popular.
We have a hand in the back.
So today we're talking about two sides. We're talking about awareness, and then we're talking about filtration and getting these sorts of pollutants out of the water supply. I think that a lot of the public seems to labor under the misapprehension that things that are dangerous are also regulated. And thinking back, there are a lot of environmental lawsuits. There's a pretty famous 1991 case against DuPont with polyfluorooctanoic acid being released into local communities, and just a lot of people filing claims against the chemical companies in that West Virginia, Delaware, Maryland area for the chemicals that they released into the area that were unregulated. And so at what point is the financial concern going to be balanced by awareness? Is raising a public awareness of the sort of pollutants that are released into the water in an unregulated fashion, is that going to be enough to cause these companies to change their practices? Because the financial repercussions of these sorts of regulations might not be favorable enough in the long term for capitalism to sort of take its course.
So, Pratik, do you want to take that?
That's maybe I should hand it to someone else.
I'm not in the federal regulatory business.
Yeah. I mean, bad publicity is a driver, you know, so if something's not regulated, but there becomes a body of evidence that says it's a problem, and this is in the newspaper every day, companies certainly respond to that.
Right.
Oh, I think so.
I mean, it's not good business, right?
It's not good business.
Yeah. No, but the question, though, is public awareness, right?
Yeah.
Those things that we don't know that could be harming us, how do they actually make it to the inbox of those decision makers who could effectively divert it? Yeah. I have a question, though, about just the federal regulatory and federal funding environment, Aaron. You talked about the lack of federal grants for a lot of the infrastructure projects that are so vital to this work. What role does the federal government here in the United States play in the water policy and water funding matrix right now?
Yeah, I mean, they play a massive
regulation matrix.
They play a major role, and you know, certainly there's a whole slew of regulations that govern the way that utilities and cities operate. So, Safe Drinking Water Act, Clean Water Act, Lead and Copper Rule. There's a bunch of these regulations that dictate how we make investments. And when those were passed in the early 70s, they came along with a lot of grants to help implement those. And that money, pun intended, dried up in the 80s in the Reagan administration. So increasingly, when new federal regulations come in place, it's an unfunded mandate to utilities to try to figure out how to pay for them. And more often than not, the only way that utilities can pay for them is to raise rates. This hasn't necessarily been the case in Chicago, since we don't have as many of consent decrees and mandates. But when I worked in Mayor Bloomberg's office in New York, we were getting hit with a new requirement, where we were having to pay for a new requirement regularly. We had to filter part of our drinking water system to meet some compliance regulations. We built a ultraviolet disinfection facility to meet an amendment to the Safe Drinking Water Act because of a cryptosporidium outbreak in Milwaukee. Even though there had been no documented cases of cryptosporidium risk in New York City, we spent about $2.5 billion to build a facility to address a mandate. Nitrogen reductions from wastewater treatment plants. So there's a whole range of these things, which aren't necessarily, they're not bad requirements by any means, but there's a challenge when you're a city and you're trying to figure out how do we prioritize our spending of money. So in the case of New York City, we would spend our money predominantly, about 2/3 of our spending was to meet federal requirements as opposed to those things that are elective, like fixing drinking water mains and upgrading our drinking water system. So we were forced into
Two-thirds of
these
the water spending
was to comply with Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act in New York. This was back in, it's gone down now, but this was back in 2010, 2011. And so what it does is it forces utilities to say, all right, if we're going to have to comply with these federal regulations, we will certainly comply with them. But what that means is we will either have to raise rates to do so or we will just not invest in those other things that are not mandated. And the number of leaks in your local drinking water mains, for example, are not held strongly under a federal mandate. So cities often ignore that. And Chicago's case, since we don't necessarily have as many of the Safe Drinking Water Act mandates, we've been able to invest our money in that. Mm-hmm. So there's a choice that often gets put to cities is raise rates or ignore non-mandated challenges.
Mm. Yes.
Yeah. So resiliency is multidimensional. So I'm just wondering, for the city of Chicago, apart from water, what are other factors which are important? And in water specifically, what steps have you taken to improve resiliency?
Sure, it's a great question. So resiliency is very multidimensional, and so what we're doing is we're in the midst of a planning process to identify what are Chicago's biggest shocks and stresses. And so when it comes to water, certainly flooding is high on that list. We're also looking very closely at social and economic stresses, vulnerability, inequality in neighborhoods. I'm sorry, the second part of your question?
What steps have you taken?
What to make our water more resilient? Well, we've made substantial infrastructure investments to improve our infrastructure and reduce flooding. So we've been investing about $250 million per year to upgrade our sewer system. We have a 5-year, $50 million green stormwater infrastructure plan that we're implementing as we speak. On the water side, we're replacing 900 miles of water main over a 10-year period, which is significantly reducing our number of water main breaks and outages for citizens. So we're making a lot of significant infrastructure investments to make sure that we're reducing disruptions and reducing property damage for our citizens. And then we're also upgrading in our major facilities, our pumping stations and our water filtration plants, to make sure that those stay in good working order and don't fall into disrepair and require more costly repairs or fixes down the road. Yes.
So I've been listening today with an ear toward someone who's going to be trying to build a faculty effort within the Institute in this area, and I'm thinking about sensors and the growth of the amount of data available. That's certainly an interesting direction. But thinking beyond that to what we do with the data, do you think that the amount of data we're going to be getting is such that we will handle this by kind of data science and machine learning techniques, or should we be thinking about hiring modeling people that try to structure a framework to put the data into?
I think that it's headed towards data science and machine learning with a small twist that I'll come to in a moment. But yes, the amount of data that is getting aggregated is enormous. So, if you think of the world as and divide it into pixels, you can then start slotting all kinds of data into each pixel: temperature, climate, wind speed, infrared signal from the satellite, all kinds of stuff, right? Soil moisture. And all of this is being led by satellite data. There's tremendous amounts coming up. Companies like Google and Amazon are mirroring all the government data right now, today, as we speak. I think IBM is doing the same. So the data is certainly going to explode. And the way to handle it today is using big data techniques, curation, machine learning. But if we just do that the way computer scientists do that, I think we're going to miss something. Because that's a sort of very statistical method. You're not putting any physics insights into this. And I think the twist here is to bring the physics part of it. For instance, you measure temperatures. You can use a simple physics model to figure out how heat is flowing. And you can use machine learning on top of that. So that would be my thought. I think that's a direction to go into.
I think that's well put, and I 100% agree. I think you don't throw away the physics, but you capture and you mine as much as you can from the physics, and then you build the AI on top of it. I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. We have one or two last questions here. Yes.
I just wanted to hear your perspectives on resiliency, particularly in the context of, so you mentioned how infrastructure is such a huge value that you can't get rid of existing infrastructure. And that infrastructure is key when you have, 100-year flood or something like that. But what about problems that are more chronic and aren't really visible? Lead comes to mind recently with the news, and as people are learning more about how lead is slowly leaching out of old pipes, how can resiliency be brought into something that is, by its nature, distributed, and how can resiliency bring something to bear on that kind of problem?
Sure, I think resiliency, if you define it broadly, incorporates all of those things, and it's really about understanding and addressing those shocks that currently exist and understanding how they will change in the future or could change based on certain changing conditions, right? Whether it's infrastructure ages, climate changes, whatever it might be. So I think all of those challenges that you mentioned certainly play a role in how we think about resiliency as a city, just like they have how we thought about sustainability, which has an overlap with resiliency, or thinking about just being a smarter, more effective government that applies good planning and good science and good data to the way we make decisions. And I think that's one area that we've made a lot of progress on, and we still have a long way to go. And I say that in an academic institution because often there's a lot of inertia in how government makes decisions or utilities make decisions, and we have ways to go to think about applying better practices or better strategies to this. And so I was talking to Session Nighter about lead and what is there a technology solution that instead of just adding phosphorus for our water supply that provides a coating that has a lot of value, is there other materials that we could be thinking about to line these pipes? I mean, that's an academic question and it's an interesting technological solution, but often we don't necessarily have the capacity as a utility just on our own, or even the sort of willingness to sort of innovate on our own, and we need partnerships with universities and private sector and other experts to sometimes push us, sometimes partner with us and take our ideas and make them reality. And so there's certainly that's all to me way we think about being a more resilient city and planning in a more resilient way.
I have another question over here.
I forget who said it this morning, but very correctly, climate and water are different. We have crises in both. One way they're different is that people feel very personal about water, right? Nobody says my air is bad, but people say my faucet, the water coming out of my faucet is bad. How can that be, that personalization, can that be leveraged in some way in each of your settings?
I mean, I think that's true. I mean, I think in a place like Chicago where people can see, depending on where you live or where you commute, you can see Lake Michigan on a fairly regular basis, and there's a connection to the Chicago River in a lot of communities, and people sort of see that more tangibly than they do this abstract notion of climate or climate change. And so I think that's one way, as we talk about the need to make these investments or the importance of these policy areas, whether it's trying to communicate to voters or it's trying to get legislation passed or advocating for certain policy change at a federal level, I think making that type of rhetorical connection to water tends to be more effective than climate.
Aaron, just as a follow-up, though, I also can see that dynamic working in the reverse, in the sense that abundance breeds complacency or disregard. As we sit here on the shores of Lake Michigan, the basin that has 1/5 of the world's surface freshwater supply, how much do you as a policymaker and others think about the public mindset and what should be done to remind people that this is a valuable and precious resource in a seemingly infinite coastline, you know?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I would certainly rather have 1/5 of the world's freshwater on our doorstep than not.
Yes,
and
yes. It's a good problem to have for Chicago.
Yeah, it's a good problem to have. Absolutely, we're lucky in that way. And I think it actually probably more plays out when we talk about things like beach quality and park and revitalization of the Chicago River than it does drinking water.
Yeah.
I mean, it's important to talk about how valuable it is, and we have to take steps to make sure that we're using the resource wisely and that we're good stewards of it. So it's important, certainly.
Maybe another angle on the question. I go to this Aquatech meeting in China every year, and 2 years ago, 2/3 or 3/4 of the display was industrial equipment. This year, I think 2/3 was home filtration, home RO, home reverse osmosis units, because there's a lack of confidence in the water supply. So people don't trust that the water coming into the house is going to be acceptable. So they handle their own water supply themselves. And I was wondering after this thing in Flint, if we'd sort of see a resurgence of that in the U.S., because if you don't have that confidence, you sort of have to take your fate in your own hands. I hope that doesn't happen, and I don't think that will happen. But it's, I don't know, it's one point relative to your question.
Well, a lot of important issues surfaced, a lot of great questions. We'll have to leave the conversation there for now, but please join me in thanking Tom Stanley, Aaron Cook, and Suprajit Guha. Thank you all very, very much.